very much for having me here. It's a thrill to be back in Prague. I've been here twice before, once in 1994, so that was a long time ago, and I was a Callow youth at the time, and then I was back again in 2007, and so that's been another long period of time has gone by, so here I am every 12 or 13 years it looks like. Maybe we'll make a habit of it. So, long the wait time to be away, but I'm very glad to be back. So Jakob asked me to talk about Kierkegaard and some of his thoughts on narrative and self-knowledge in particular, and so I've prepared some remarks on that subject. There's a lot we could talk about, and I'm happy to broach other aspects of Kierkegaard's narrative theory and how narrative maybe touches on selfhood more thoroughly in the question and answer. What I've prepared tonight is really quite informal in some ways. I just want to talk about some instances of Kierkegaard's use of story and how that might provoke certain kinds of self-recognition or self-knowledge in the people who read those stories that he has to impart to us. So Søren Kierkegaard is famous in part because he is as great a literary artist as he is a philosopher. I think in the entire history of Western civilization, perhaps only Plato ranks above him in both philosophical insight and stylistic beauty, which is a very rare combination indeed, and one that's quite difficult to achieve. A large part of Kierkegaard's renown with respect to his literary accomplishment has to do with his facility with stories. He obviously loved all sorts of stories. He loves fairy tales, myths, narratives drawn from history, from the Bible, and from the Greek and Latin classics. And he used these stories expertly in the course of his own philosophical writings. Today I would like to look at some examples of Kierkegaard's use of story to try to identify what he thinks are the limits and promises of storytelling when it comes to the question of the self. The first thing to insist upon is that a story is an aesthetic phenomenon. And what Kierkegaard calls the aesthetic plays a dual role in his thought. The aesthetic is in the first place the domain of art and poetry. And in the second place, it's a style of life, one that ranks comparatively low in Kierkegaard's estimation. In a way that it's an oddity that Kierkegaard should at once be so accomplished in the aesthetic realm, such a fine stylist and poet, really, and yet so critical of the sort of lifestyle that he calls the aesthetic. So what is the aesthetic life all about? Well, it's the life lived in pursuit of the beautiful and the interesting. It tends toward fleeting emotion and flighty attentiveness to commitments that are ephemeral, interests that are momentary, and projects that are doomed to be left unfinished. The aesthetic life is the one pursued by the aesthete, that common character type who inhabited so many 19th century decadent novels and poems, the fashionable dandy who refuses marriage and steady employment and bourgeois values in favor of the enticements of the moment. So we might share Kierkegaard's intuition that such a life seems superficial or incomplete or lacking in depth or serious commitments and lifelong projects, sustained relationships, all those things that promise a great many challenges, but also a great many rewards. But when it comes to trying to give a more robust philosophical account of what precisely should be wrong with such a style of living, contemporary Kierkegaard scholars are sometimes at something of a loss. So today I want to say something about what exactly it is about the aesthetic that falls short in Kierkegaard's mind, and mostly I will talk about the limits of aesthetic objects like stories, but much of what I will have to say applies to the aesthetic style of life as well. In a word, if we're to simplify, I think the answer could come down to what Kierkegaard in various works calls the ideal quality of the aesthetic. In his journals, Kierkegaard wrote the following, and I quote, he said, "What does it mean to poetize? It means to contribute ideality. The poet takes an actuality which lacks something of ideality and adds to it, and this is the poem." So according to this short declaration, the poetic or aesthetic project is one that is wedded to idealization. The poet or the aesthete takes an actuality, a real state of affairs, and adds to it, idealizes it. So what sort of gesture is this? Well, I think it has to do with the fact that the aesthetic style of life also has something in common with the ideal qualities of an aesthetic object, a work of art like a story. Part of what Kierkegaard means when he says that the aesthetic is an ideal realm is that the aesthetic, whether considered as a way of life or in terms of an object like a story, crystallizes certain conventions or norms that it holds up as an ideal and asks us to consider. So what's an aesthetic ideal? Well, I think an aesthetic ideal is one that's enshrined in sort of storytelling or artistic conventions, the rules that make for a satisfying narrative or an accomplished work of art. Similarly, the aesthetic life gives expression to what the self desires, its hopes, its preferences, its wishes for the pleasing, for the fortunate. These are the categories that the aesthetic person lives by. So if we look at problem 3 in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard's most famous and influential work, we find him there engaging with a number of vividly told narratives. There's the story from Aristotle's Poetics of the Delphic bridegroom who leaves his fiancée at the last moment before marrying her. He does this because of a curse pronounced against him and his intended bride. We find the Danish folktale of Agnes and the Merman. We find the deuterocanonical story of Tobit from the apocryphal part of the Bible. We find the story of Faust, right, and his beloved Margaret. And of course the story of Abraham, his intended sacrifice of his son Isaac, which forms the centerpiece of Fear and Trembling. At one point in the same section, he takes up Euripides' tragedy, Iphigenia and Aulis, which tells the story of Artemis's demand that the king Agamemnon sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia in order to appease the goddess and make it possible for the Greeks to set sail and make war against Troy. Agamemnon's resolve to sacrifice his daughter is put to the test to great dramatic effect by the disclosure of his intent to sacrifice Iphigenia to both Iphigenia herself and to her mother, Clytemnestra. On the one hand, Kierkegaard says the following. He says, aesthetics demands silence of Agamemnon, inasmuch as it would be unworthy of the hero to seek comfort from any other person, just as out of solicitude for the women he ought to hide it from them as long as possible. On the other hand, in order to be a hero, the hero also has to be tried in the dreadful spiritual trial that the tears of Clytemnestra and Iphigenia will cause. So in order for Agamemnon to be a tragic hero, he has to face his dilemma four square, despite the appeals to emotion with which his loved ones will tempt him away from his duty. So he's obligated as king, right, to go through with the sacrifice of his daughter. But if this is going to be a really good story, right, his daughter has to find out what he has in mind, right, and there has to be a kind of dramatic tension. So the spectacle of him being tempted in this way makes for a really good drama. So the aesthetic, too, you might say, has an interest in disclosing the secret of Agamemnon's plan, which it engineers by means of a coincidental contrivance. In the play, an old servant shares the news of Agamemnon's plans with Clytemnestra, right? She overhears him talking about this, right? And so she goes and runs off and tells his wife on him, right? And so now the secret is out. And once that happens, Kierkegaard says, now everything is in order, right? Like all the dramatic tension has been set up. For the tragedy to work properly, Kierkegaard argues, the tragic hero Agamemnon has to be forthright with his intended victim. He has to personally take on the burden of being tested by his daughter's full awareness of what is to happen to her. The tragic hero, he says, demonstrates his ethical courage in that he himself, not prey to any aesthetic illusion, he himself announces Iphigenia's fate to her. So that requirement is imposed upon Agamemnon in the play by means of a dramatic device, and for the purpose of enhancing the dramatic power of the narrative. Kierkegaard writes the following, and I quote, aesthetics demanded disclosure, but aided itself with a coincidence. But actuality has no coincidence, and no old servant at its disposal. The aesthetic idea contradicts itself as soon as it is to be implemented in actuality. End of quote. So what does that mean, right? The aesthetic idea contradicts itself as soon as it's to be implemented in actuality. Well, I think it does that because actual life rarely works out in the same convenient way as a tragic narrative does, right? I mean, a tragic narrative unfolds according to certain rules and has certain kinds of contrivances at its disposal to make the dramatic result happen in a way that our lives never really do this, right? They don't have that same kind of convenience. In actuality, there may not be a coincidence or a deus ex machina resolution. There may not be a convenient turn of events that will ratchet up that dramatic tension. The irony of Greek tragedy, the force of fate that it gives expression to, these things are simply not often to be found in life as it is actually lived, but they're the product of artistic idealization of life's actuality. The machinations of fate, the twists and turns of hiddenness and recognition bouncing off each other, the reversals of fortune that turn the lives of characters upside down, are not a product of the actual, but are imputed to the actual by the poet's own idealizing work, right? It's Euripides who makes this sort of work as a tragic as a tragic work of fiction, but it's not a reflection of what real life normally operates by. So this is the first shortcoming of the aesthetic that I want to highlight. Because aesthetics deals with what is ideally the case, it is at a remove from actuality. A good story works out with an ideal purity, a kind of economy or efficiency that eliminates all the unnecessary and distracting elements from reality in order to focus on a streamlined and powerful story. Because Agamemnon is in a tragedy, then of course coincidences arise that ratchet up that dramatic tension. But actual life is not a tragedy. And it's not really a comedy either, but in some ways it's by turns tragic and comic. And the two often relate in sort of surprising and unpredictable ways. We're used to aesthetic manipulations like from watching Hollywood movies, right? I mean, Hollywood movies have the same kind of, ideal forms, right? There's a certain kind of stock way that plots are supposed to proceed, right? So Alfred Hitchcock, right, once famously said that drama is just real life with all the dull bits cut out, right? So you get rid of all the dull parts and you're left with like some really exciting stuff, right? Similarly, think of the way that a film often announces itself as being based on true events, right? Like, what do you know that means, right? As soon as a film says it's based on true events, it's a sure sign that what we're about to see is fiction, right? We're about to see something that's been made a little bit more convenient, right? A little bit more watchable. Or in Kierkegaard's words, we're about to watch an idealization, right? We're about to see an idealization of real life. So the person who lives the aesthetic life, right? The person who lives the life of the dandy aims to have their existence conform to the conventions of a good story, right? They want their life to kind of exhibit that sort of dramatic purity. The aesthete wants her life to be interesting and never boring or dull. She wants her life to be an endlessly fascinating cavalcade of stimulating distractions and amusing diversions without the burdens of commitments or stability or tedious adherence to things like responsibility. So all of us, I think, in Kierkegaard's judgment, are susceptible to these attractions, right? To the attractions that the aesthetic life holds out. Just as a story has a coherent logic to it, so too we think of our own lives as a story that we're writing ourselves. A story with a certain organic development to it, right? An almost fated necessity of one inevitability leading to the next, and finally, a happy ending, right? But actual life, according to Kierkegaard, rarely works out this smoothly. Actual life, in a word, is not ideal in the way a work of art or a life modeled on artistically satisfying conventions is ideal, or at least tries to be ideal. To illustrate a second shortcoming of the aesthetic ideal, let me turn to another vignette from Problem 3 in Fear and Trembling. I have in mind the Danish folk tale of Agnes and the Merman. Now, this legend would have been quite familiar to Kierkegaard's readers in 19th century Denmark. It was a very familiar folk tale. And in this story, Agnes is a young woman who yearns for an interesting existence. She's sitting by the side of the sea, listening to the waves crash on the shore and longing for some kind of adventure. Unbeknownst to her at first, there's a lecherous merman who's espied her from the sea, and he's resolved to seduce her and whisk her away to his home at the bottom of the ocean. Now, in the original folk story, Agnes is successfully seduced and bears the merman a number of children, only to abandon him and their offspring when she hears the church bells tolling back on land. And out of homesickness, she persuades the merman to release her on the condition that she'll come back to him and her children, which she never does, right? She stays on land and forsakes them all. But Kierkegaard changes this story. He changes this familiar tale. And in his version, he allows the merman's lecherous intent to be thwarted by Agnes, who he says is perfectly innocent, right? Her innocence thwarts his attempts because when he comes out from the sea, he's possessed by lust, but he finds that Agnes is totally innocent and trusting. She has no idea what he really intends, and so she gives herself to him in this perfect trust. Now, this is a totally unforeseen development on the merman's part, which unmans him and sends him sinking back to the bottom of the sea in defeat, right? Now, in this modified version of the folktale, Kierkegaard stipulates that the merman is repentant for his attempt to seduce Agnes, right? He's sorry that he tried to do it in the first place. And then he faces some alternatives, right? The alternatives that he delineates are that the Merman is either in repentance alone, and that's something that he says opens the door to what he calls the demonic, or he can be in repentance with Agnes, right? He can actually have a relationship with her on the basis of his contrition about his prior behavior. If he's repentant by himself, right, that first option, then Kierkegaard says that they will both be unhappy, right? And they're unhappy because the Merman's alone and he faces the reality of who he is, right? He's a really bad person. And in particular, the Merman, he says, will be burdened with a new guilt as he condemns himself to a lifetime of self-hatred, bound forever to despise himself for his own wickedness. The Merman's self-hatred is provoked by Agnes's trusting innocence. And on this scenario, he remains hidden and alone because he cannot admit to Agnes his original sinful intent. Trapped by his refusal to repent constructively with Agnes, the demonic in repentance, Kierkegaard says, will explain that this is indeed his punishment, and the more it torments him, the better, right? He deserves to punish himself, right? He deserves to be alone. In his guilt, he decides that he deserves to be alone and unloved. He's unworthy of Agnes and her faith in him. Because he's seen something of himself, right, in the mirror of her innocence, right? Her innocence is like a mirror that he's looked into. And what he sees there is terrible, right? He sees something awful about himself. And he concludes from this that his loathsomeness is unforgivable. And he becomes in a kind of demonic rage, perversely attached to this image of himself as tortured and stricken and beyond all salvation, right? He becomes to think of himself as not being able to be helped, right? To be unredeemed forever. So Kierkegaard calls this the demonic, right? The demonic is a kind of willful sinfulness, according to him. It's a refusal to be forgiven for what one has done bad. The demonic personality is one that wills itself out of fury to be totally isolated and to shut up within itself. In another work of his, Kierkegaard says that the demonic expresses itself perfectly in some of the most horrible words that anyone can utter. He says, the demonic says, leave me alone in my wretchedness. Right? Leave me alone in my wretchedness. This is the first option that the Merman could take. He can be so sorry for his sinful intent that he refuses to be forgiven and he refuses to forgive himself. Right? And instead he languishes forever in self-hatred and guilt. Now in some ways this is the very opposite of what Kierkegaard means by faith. Right? Faith is something that opens us up, I think, to relationship. It opens us up to the possibility of being loved and being forgiven. And yet Kierkegaard says that in a certain sense there is so much more good in a demonic than in superficial people. That in a way, there's much more good in a demonic person than there is in superficial people. Now, how can that be? I think that can only be so if the demonic person sees more clearly what superficial people don't see, which is that they are sinners, right? That they really know themselves, right, in a way that superficial people don't, right? They've never confronted themselves in the depths of their own souls. And hand in hand with that recognition, the demonic person sees what it takes to be forgiven of sin. That it means the end of who they are in some way, right? They have to put the old person to death, as it were. They have to surrender their sinfulness and their willingness. They have to accept a willingness to humbly accept another person's trust and love, precisely in their very wretchedness. To be forgiven, to be healed, right, is to admit that we are bad people, but we accept somebody else's love, even though we know that we're bad people. That's the second option that the Merman could pursue. Kierkegaard writes the following. He says, if he becomes disclosed, if the Merman lets himself be saved by Agnes, then he is the greatest human being I can imagine. For it is only aesthetics that thoughtlessly supposes it is praising the power of love by having the prodigal be loved by an innocent girl and thereby saved. It is only aesthetics that perceives mistakenly and believes that the girl is the heroic figure instead of the Merman. Right? So who's the real hero in the story? Right? He says it's not Agnes herself. Right? It's not the perfectly innocent one. It's the Merman if he actually is willing to accept her love. Right? Then he becomes a kind of hero. If the Merman opens himself up to the love of another person, then he's the real hero of the story. But understanding him at all requires an awareness of the passion that is sinful defiance, as well as the passion that is faith, its opposite. So the Merman, at his point of suspense, like what will he do, right? Which choice will he make? At that moment, he stands for anyone who has been tempted by the demonic, right? The choice that we must make is either an offense to remain defiant or to return to a wholesome ethical life in repentance. In a footnote near the end of his discussion of Agnes and the Merman, the author of this text writes the following. Aesthetics, he says, sometimes treats a similar situation in its usual game-playing way. The merman is saved by Agnes, and the whole thing ends with a happy marriage. A happy marriage, that's easy enough. Aesthetics just sees to it that the lovers find each other and does not concern itself about the rest. If only it would see what happens afterwards. But it has no time for that and promptly proceeds to slap a new pair of lovers together. Of all the branches of knowledge, aesthetics is the most faithless. So, there's a sort of superficial way of understanding the conclusion to the story of Agnes and the Merman. And this story would content aesthetics if the lovers get married and live happily ever after, right? It's the perfect ending, right? It's a perfect story, right? It's a comedy. And that's an aesthetic ideal, right? Things work out just the way we want them to. But we know that that ideal is inapplicable to reality precisely because all too often people don't live happily ever after, or at least not in the way they imagine they will, right? Not in the way they imagine on their wedding day, let's say, right? Aesthetics is content to get the happy couple to the altar, and there it leaves them. But marriage is not what happens to you and your partner on the day you get married. It's what happens every day after that, right? Marriage is a lifelong process of loving another person and opening yourself in humility and trust to being loved by that person, in the full knowledge that your trust will be betrayed, and you'll have to forgive them. And then you'll have to forgive. And you'll be sinned against again. And you will sin against your beloved in turn. And then you'll have to be forgiven. And the whole process will be repeated again and again. It's the lifelong process of learning patience and gratitude and forbearance. And aesthetics is just not ordinarily up to the task of giving us a complete, coherent, and serious account of just such a life. Or at the very least, it's harder to realize the potential aesthetic appeal of a narrative that goes deeper than the obvious high points of life. But aesthetic narratives usually just give us the high points, right? They bring us up to the altar, to the proverbial happy ending, and there the story ends. But Kierkegaard says that it's a given, on any scenario, that the merman can no longer be a seducer after being defeated by Agnes's innocence. He can be saved by Agnes, Kierkegaard writes, but this must not be interpreted to mean that by Agnes's love he would be saved from becoming a seducer in the future. This, he says, is an aesthetic rescue attempt that always evades the main point, the continuity in the merman's life. For in that respect, he is saved already. So the main point is not that he is delivered from being a seducer in the future. The main point is that he now has to navigate the future in relationship with his own past. He becomes a new man, not in the moment that he abandons his past, but every day thereafter, preserving the continuity of his self by every day becoming a new self, embracing a change that brings about his continued moral transformation and improvement. So the trick is, right, the real issue is how does he become a new person while never forgetting the fact that he was the old person, right? How does he remain the same person and yet change? And this is an issue that preoccupies Kierkegaard throughout his writings, right? How does one become somebody else while still remaining the same, right? And there's a kind of paradox at the heart of all of us, right? All of us undergo changes, dramatic changes even, and yet we are still the same person, right, in some fundamental way. So this is key, I think, to understand the second of Kierkegaard's reservations about the limits of the aesthetic, or limits of narrative or story that I want to talk about today. That second reservation is that the aesthetic ideal seems almost necessarily to be abbreviated in such a way as to make it difficult to take in what he calls here the continuity of a human life. The respect in which life is made up of both stability, right? I always have to remain who I am, but also change. I'm always becoming somebody else, and I'm doing that either for better or for worse. Kierkegaard says, for this reason, that aesthetics always has what he calls a foreshortened perspective. It can't give us that long view. At one point in telling the Merman story, Kierkegaard says that his heroism consists in the fact that he realizes that it is far more difficult to receive than to give, right? And here Kierkegaard, of course, is playing with the scriptural sentiment that, right, that it's more blessed to give than to receive, right? So he kind of turns that around and he says, but in a way it's harder to receive than to give, right? It's harder to receive than to give. The Merman must receive rather than actively constitute his life. He has to receive the trusting love of Agnes without self-hatred or shame over his former self. At the same time, he cannot merely suppress his former self, as if who he was before his encounter with Agnes could just be discarded, which is sort of what aesthetics would have, right? Aesthetics wants to say, okay, problem solved, happy ending, right, off we go. But that's not going to work, right? The trick of continuity is to be the self that you are, while daily becoming the better self that you really want to be. A real life being transformed constructively is precisely the ongoing process of renegotiating the terms on which my life can go forward toward greater progress while I still remain who I am. Not abandoning myself altogether, but giving up the self that I insist on being on my own terms in favor of receiving a new self on refreshed terms. At one point in his discussion of this story, Kierkegaard says that a real aesthetics would begin right where it ordinarily leaves off. If you really wanted to tell a good story, right, you would start where most stories sort of finish, right? You start with that kind of happy ending and see what happens from there. A true aesthetic, a really good story about the Merman, would tell us not about the happy ending of his marriage to Agnes and leave us there, but would use this moment as the beginning of a new story and tell us how he became an improved person through the day-to-day living out of his commitment to her, becoming a more and more worthy husband. So how do I know I'm making progress rather than merely changing? How do I know that the Merman is being transformed for the better rather than simply developing in a kind of haphazard manner? Well, remember that the story of Agnes and the Merman is largely about repentance. And repentance can be either isolating and self-hating, or it can be constructive and conducive towards self-improvement. In another one of his works, Kierkegaard wrote that repentance does indeed look backward, right? It looks back over our life and the things that we're sorry about. But it does so, he says, nevertheless, in such a way that precisely thereby it quickens its pace toward what lies ahead, right? It presses us on toward something better. There's an exact isomorphism between this phrasing and an important passage from his first book, The Concept of Anxiety, where Kierkegaard argues that the relationship of human life to an ideal is both backward and forward-looking. He says, in no way is the true ideal in the beyond. It is behind us insofar as it is a propelling force that pushes us. Right? And it's ahead of us insofar as it's the inspiring goal. So it draws us ahead toward itself. But at the same time, it is within us. And this, he says, is its truth, right? To be within. So the life in transformation is therefore a life in which the ideal to which my life aspires is within me, working toward my inward transformation. This is the truth of the ideal. It's not an inaccessible transcendent. It's not an unrecoverable immemorial past, but it's an active force that's taken up in lived imitation. The aesthetic, as Kierkegaard said above, is content to tell a good story, to construct an ideal that is, in the end, is totally unlivable. Kierkegaard says that the aesthetic contradicts itself as soon as it is to be applied to reality because life doesn't work out with this satisfying tidiness and perfect conformity to storytelling canons. And it always stops right where it should really begin, before getting into the realistic business of narrating the hard work of daily improvement, patiently trying to vanquish sin every day and to try to become a better person. So when it comes to the capabilities of the aesthetic or storytelling, I think we're on solid Kierkegaardian grounds to be concerned about the capacity of traditional narrative to give an account of a life in the process of improvement. There's a recent trend to associate Kierkegaard with the project of using narratives to explain selfhood, right? There's a whole trend in contemporary analytic philosophy especially to think of the self as somehow modeled on narrative, right? The self is really a kind of story that's unfolding, right? It's not a thing, right? But it's a kind of a tale, right? Something that we're living out. But that trend has been challenged for this very reason, right? On the grounds that narrative can be quite aestheticizing. It simplifies, right? It has a tendency to concentrate on the streamlined high points rather than on sort of day-to-day banalities. But I think Kierkegaard is sensitive to this concern, right? I don't think this necessarily defeats the project, because I think he's aware that this is a danger for us. Right? Kierkegaard does seem to point toward a revised Poetics as having the potential power to narrate a full human life if such a Poetics can overcome the ordinary failures of its own conventions. Its ordinary failures to apply to real life, and its failure to narrate the whole of human existence lived in constant improvement in such a way as to gesture toward what Kierkegaard calls a new religious ideal. This is why I think Kierkegaard consistently distances his own storytelling, especially right here in Problem 3 from Fear and Trembling. This is the part I've been talking about all along. Everywhere he talks about story in this section of the book, he distances his own way of telling stories from that of what he calls the poets, right? And the poets, for him, I think, are sort of the stereotypical advocates for the power of poetry, for the power of aesthetics. But every time, right, he says, if the poets are the ones who are speaking for the traditional aesthetic ideal, he says, I'm going to change everything that they do, right? And his own way of telling stories is self-consciously at a remove from what the poets would do. He explicitly says that his own version of the folktale of Agnes and the Merman is not the one that the poets have told up until now. And he further admits that he has changed Agnes's character. He also, as we have seen, insists that the story, when properly told, makes the Merman into the hero rather than Agnes. Again, this is expressly contrary to the standard interpretation of the story. Such disavowals accompany each of the stories Kierkegaard tells in the book's final and longest Problem 3 section. So what I want to suggest is that Kierkegaard is actually engaged in constructing a kind of revised poetics, a narrative form that can express continuity in a human life, guided by faithful conformity, not to an aesthetic ideal, but to a religious ideal. So, what's the difference, right? What's the difference between an aesthetic ideal and a religious ideal? Well, if we look at the introduction to the concept of anxiety, that's a book that Kierkegaard was writing at the exact same time as he was writing Fear and Trembling. In that book, he calls the religious ideal the ideal of actuality. Right? So it's a kind of a paradox in that it's at once actual and ideal. We've seen that aesthetics concerns the ideal, and because it has to do with idealization, aesthetics contradicts itself when it's applied to actuality. In real life, there is rarely a well-timed coincidence that increases dramatic tension or brings about an unexpected happy ending. Similarly, in real life, we don't get to just enjoy a momentary happiness that makes the rest of our day-to-day existence unproblematic. We have to live each day with all of its worries. But what I want to suggest is that the religious ideal, the ideal that is at the same time actual, is an ideal that does not contradict itself when applied to actuality. It's an ideal that I can actually live out. It's an ideal which, for me to live out as ideal, has to take into account the actuality of who I really am. It has to confront the real me with all of my problems and shortcomings. So if we think once more about the Merman, for him to live a real life with Agnes, he has to be repentant for his past sins and be willing to be forgiven for them by a loving another. He has to confront the fact that he's a sinner and accept forgiveness. He can't allow himself to be demonically obsessed with a paralyzing self-hatred over his past, but he has to soberly and eagerly look forward to a future of healthy moral progress. Kierkegaard said, remember, that this is the real truth of an ideal. It looks back, in a sense, taking in the whole of who I've been, but it only looks back in order to hasten toward what is ahead, full of trust and acceptance of who I can be, if I open myself to the love of others. This is the third and final shortcoming of the aesthetic that I want to remark on in concluding today. Aesthetics, according to Kierkegaard, ordinarily cannot do justice to the reality of sin. Again, in the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard writes that we can tell that the actuality of sin is being warped when we treat it with an incorrect mood. Every concept, he says, has an emotional tone that is appropriate to it. and aesthetics proves its incapacity to really address actual sin when it handles sin by either being tragic or comic, but in neither case completely serious. He writes the following: when sin is brought into aesthetics, the mood becomes either light-minded or melancholy, for the category in which sin lies is that of contradiction, and this is either comic or tragic. The mood is therefore altered because the mood that corresponds to sin is earnestness or seriousness. The concept of sin is also altered because whether it becomes comic or tragic, it becomes in any case something that endures or something non-essential that is annulled. Whereas according to its true concept, sin is to be overcome. In a deeper sense, the comic and the tragic have no enemy, but only a boogeyman at which one either weeps or laughs. So if we subject sin to aesthetic treatment, it becomes either the object of comic laughter or of sort of melancholic hand-wringing and worry. Right? In neither case is a proper earnestness or seriousness achieved. And in neither case is sin rightly viewed as something to be overcome, that is, something to be actively vanquished by daily effort. The only way to overcome sin is to conquer it again and again, inasmuch as every moment we are in sin, we are sick with it by our own willing. And mere acquiescence to this state of affairs is tantamount to actively prolonging it, as if we were making ourselves worse. This is why he says the comic and the tragic have no real enemy, right? Only a kind of a boogeyman, right? A kind of a spook, an object for scornful mocking or self-pitying weepiness. In both cases, sin becomes a kind of spectacle that can solicit what are only superficially opposed reactions, instead of a hard reality that needs urgently to be uprooted. So if a story is to be told that will do justice to the reality of sin and the forgiveness of sin, then the conventions by which stories are normally told will have to change. This is why in every single story that Kierkegaard tells in Problem 3 of Fear and Trembling, he claims he is changing it in such a way as to make it divergent from the normal way that it's told by the poets, the normal aesthetic way of telling the story. He does this, I think, because he wants the story to have transformational power, to actually take hold of my life in such a way as to bring it into greater perfection. The real ideal is one that I can live out, not one that I merely aspire to. So a story properly told can have the power to draw me to imitate it, rather than merely contemplate it at a kind of distance, right? To provoke such a transformation, though, a story has to be told in such a way as to engage me, right? To engage my own self at the deepest level. I have to recognize myself in the Merman. Recognize that his story, in a sense, is my story. Even though in the details, of course, it can't be my story, right? It's made up. It's a folk's tale, right? Now, the single most illustrative case I can think of on this point comes again from the concept of anxiety. In that book, Kierkegaard tells the story of a hermit of whom it was said that after living on nothing but the dew that he collected from the flowers every morning, he one day came to the city, tasted wine, and became addicted to drink, right? This poor spiritual man, right, who's been living humbly, right, in his little cave. He drinks nothing but the dew off the morning flowers, and then one day he goes to the city, which of course is a place of corruption, right? He tastes one drink of alcohol, and he falls into addiction, right? So, if we treat this story as if it were just an aesthetic object, then we can respond to the sin of the Indian hermit either tragically or comically, but both reactions are sort of unserious, right? They're both inadequate. To respond tragically or comically, and we even hear, I tell the story, right, and some of us are sort of like, snickering, right? It's like, oh, poor guy, right, yeah. It's like, that's the natural way that we respond to a story like that, right? But to do that is to be, in a way, insincere, right? At a distance, I think, from its real moral. If we respond to the story that way, we respond to it as if it were merely a story, right? As if it didn't concern us, right? So we can make some fun of the poor hermit, or we can pity him, but both sentimentality and chagrin keep our own selves at a distance from what a narrative like that of the hermit is trying to teach us. And it keeps us at a distance from actual life itself. It keeps us at a distance from even our own lives, I would suggest. Rather than keep her distance from the subject of the story, the self, Kierkegaard says, should be absolutely identified with the unfortunate man. We should be absolutely identified with the subject of the story. What that means, he says, goes beyond the pagan wisdom of Horace, right? You know the anecdote from Horace, right? You know, someone tells a story about somebody else's foibles, right? And everybody laughs, right? And Horace says, why are you laughing, right? He says, all you gotta do is change the name, and the story's about you, right? You know, it's not a funny thing, right, to realize that the story really is about all of us in a way, right? Or about any of us. He says it goes even deeper than that, right? It goes deeper than that. With the name changed, the story is told about you. Sometimes you hear, too, sort of a pseudo-Christian kind of pious sentiment, right? People say, oh, there, but for the grace of God, go I, right? Like, if it weren't for God, right, restraining me, I would be just as bad, right? And again, I think that doesn't quite capture what Kierkegaard wants us to see. The point of such pieces of wisdom, right, is that I could just as easily be that guy, right? I could just as easily be the guy that the story is told about, right? But I think what Kierkegaard wants us to think is not, I could just as easily be that guy, right? I think he wants us to think, I already am that guy, right? That is me, right? It's not that it's another me, or it's not that it's possible for me, it's that that's already really me, right? The basis on which the self could be absolutely identified with the hermit in the story is the basis of what he calls sin consciousness. To be aware of myself as being susceptible to sin in exactly the same way the hermit is, even though, of course, I may not be, right? It may not be my problem exactly, right? His problem is not necessarily my problem. I have my own problem that I'm supposed to be confronting. And the story is supposed to help me do that. If we really are engaged in our deepest selves by this story, we can't afford to be condescending to the hermit, because we know we're just as guilty, and that our lives are just as much in the hands of a supervening providence. If we're pitying or disdainful, then in either case we fail to recognize not just a possible version of ourselves, but we fail to recognize ourselves straight away. And thus, I think we fall into a kind of tragicomic self-delusion, right? Or a lack of self-awareness. We fail to recognize that the point of the story of the hermit is not so much what did or even could have happened, right? The point is not that he went to the city and became an alcoholic, but rather that he was really an alcoholic all along. Right? What the hermit needs to know is himself. He needs to know that whether he stays in the country or goes to the city, he is susceptible to this problem. Even if he has subsisted only on the dew from the flowers for 2 years, he needs to know he is susceptible to drink. How can he know this, though? How can he know this without the relevant experience, right? We want to say, well, if you never tried, right, how can you tell, right? This is the use that narratives can accomplish, right? I think Kierkegaard thinks this is what a story can accomplish. And in fact, something has to be able to accomplish this task. Otherwise, we would require experience of all possible kinds of sin in order to learn our own susceptibility to them and the lesson that they must be avoided, right? At one point, Kierkegaard refers to the intolerable conclusion reached by the Carpocratian heretics, whom Kierkegaard mentions in connection with the discussion of guilt, right? The Carpocratians held that you had to commit every possible sin, right, to find out which ones were really the worst for you, right? And then you would go to avoid them, right? So you should go out and do all kinds of horrible things, right? And then so that you can find out which ones are really bad, right? Which ones you ought to avoid. So Kierkegaard says, look, there's actually a kernel of wisdom in that idea, right? And what it consists in is recognizing that guilt can be, in a way, formative, right? Or it can educate us about certain possibilities. That we ought to be aware, right, or on guard against various kinds of sin. The reason it's a heresy, though, is that they think that that view has to be realized concretely, right? That one has to actually commit the sin that rightfully makes a person anxious, right? He says, we don't need to actually do these things. What we need, he says, in order to accomplish the feat of self-recognition, is he says we need just one such story. We need one story that will actually grip us right there in the seat of ourselves, right? And help us to recognize ourselves and our own problems. This explains why he prefers the Latin phrase unum noris omnis, right? So Horace says, de te fabula narrator, right? You know, change the name and the story is told of you. He says, I like unum noris omnis. That means you know one, you know them all. You know one, you know them all. And he says, the one that you gotta know is yourself. Right? If you know yourself, you know all. Right? And what do I know best, right? If I'm really searching myself, what do I know best about myself if not my own proclivity toward evil? My own readiness to try a new sin, even, or perhaps especially one, with which I have in fact no prior experience, right? Always up for an adventure, right? There's always something else that's worth trying. Is that not exactly what I recognize in the story of the hermit? That the ground for the possibility of one's self-identification with another self is our shared awareness of our proclivity toward sin. What I know best and most readily about me, I also know about everybody else. And that's not an occasion for tragic hand-wringing or comic derision, but it's a matter of the utmost human earnestness. Once more, Kierkegaard says that all I need is one story like that of the hermit to make me realize something important about myself. Well, why do we need only one such story? Because it touches something actual about me, right? My own disposition towards sinfulness. And it means that one such story like this is not a mere aesthetic object, right? It's not just a story, but it's a potentially life-changing source of insight into myself. And Kierkegaard thinks that I need such a narrative to discern the truth about myself because I cannot know myself as a sinner by myself, right? Nobody wakes up in the morning and says to themselves, you know what, I'm a terrible person, right? I commit all kinds of awful things. There's a theological reason for this, I think. He would say that no sinner can know herself as a sinner without a revelation from God. That sin is to be revealed as the first article of Christian faith is a constantly repeated theme of Kierkegaard's authorship. And there's also an anthropological reason. Because the self, he thinks, is a relation that knows itself through and in relation with others. And it recognizes itself in what it is not. Right? I need others to recognize something about myself. Right? I'm not transparent to myself in the way that, say, Descartes imagined. Right? The self in positive transformation recognizes she already is the hermit. But of course she recognizes as well that she's not the hermit, right? Her sin is not his sin, nor could it be. In the same way, the true self who recognizes the potentially instructive power of a story sees in the Merman story not somebody else's shortcomings or weaknesses, but her own. She sees that the Merman is herself in an important way, even though her precise failing may not be the Merman's precise failing. How sin came into the world, Kierkegaard once wrote, each one understands solely by himself. If he would learn it from another, he would by that very fact misunderstand it. So that this understanding can take place at all, given that one cannot learn sin from another, is the mystery of a life lived with self-knowledge. Each person, he says, who is mindful of himself knows what no science knows. If I know myself, I know what no science knows. We cannot know that we are sinners simply by studying abstract philosophy or anthropology or ethics or human nature. Everyone can know their own sin by confronting it themselves. And this confrontation can be helped by encounters with purposefully constructed narratives, like those of the hermit or of the Merman. Self-awareness is not something I can give myself, but that comes to me through the use of the transformative power of story in an act of imagination. I'm not that sinner, but I am a sinner just as she is. The narratives used by Kierkegaard are perhaps the primary means of facilitating this recognition of myself in another. But to do this, my story needs the help of religious categories. I cannot rely on a merely aesthetic ideal. I have to live by a religious ideal that holds up to me not merely an abstract vision that I am to contemplate passively, but a real achievable goal that I am meant to live out concretely throughout my entire life. The religious ideal is one that incorporates into itself the reality of my sinfulness and the need that I have to be forgiven. And when these things are realized in and by my own self, then I live according to a new ideal, one that doesn't collapse when applied to reality, but that fuels my existence day in and day out, pointing up my failures and helping me to overcome them. The task of living a continuous life, the call to live in the light of faith, is in the end one that lends itself to illustration by and embodiment in narrative of a special sort. If such a thing were not possible at all, if aesthetics was no help whatsoever in coming to acknowledge my own sinfulness, there would be little sense in telling the Merman story, or the hermit's story, or Abraham's story, or many of the very many stories that Kierkegaard tells throughout his authorship, especially when we keep in mind the fact that Kierkegaard's entire project is targeted at affecting transformation in his readers. He doesn't want us to just think new thoughts, he wants us to be new people. A story told not according to abstract ideals, but according to the reality of who I am, with a genuine possibility of making progress, is one that can contribute to my positive transformation. And in this way, it seems to me, for him, a story can be more than a merely aesthetic phenomenon. If a story will be told in such a way as to embrace the actuality of sin, it can be expressive of a religious ideal, not merely an aesthetic ideal. But a story told in conformity with a religious ideal also captures something of the aesthetic too. Life lived in the light of the religious ideal is supremely beautiful and interesting too. The hallmark of faith for Kierkegaard is a sense of my own sinfulness combined with an openness to the forgiveness of that sin. And this means that the religious ideal promises true happiness in a way that aesthetics just can't. Of all the limits to the aesthetic, perhaps none is more important in Kierkegaard's judgment than the fact that classic, unreconstructed storytelling techniques cannot deal with the actuality of who we really are. Kierkegaard's own use of story then is meant to transform me by making me aware of my own sin and my need for forgiveness. This is a lifelong process that can be lived day in and day out in a way that the aesthetic ideal normally fails to capture this continuity in myself. And finally, the religious ideal of sin consciousness and acceptance of forgiveness captures something of the deus ex machina character of the aesthetic ideal. The aesthetic ideal has only coincidences to help realize its agenda. But the religious ideal allows me to live the ultimate deus ex machina. God really does arrive precipitously on the scene in the form of divine grace. For it is that grace that leaps into my existence at the last second, making me aware of my own problems and preparing me to accept forgiveness for them. And that's not an aesthetic rescue attempt, but a genuine religious deliverance. And that story is one that is worth telling. Thanks very much for your attention.